1 week season.
1 week season, fam, La Familia. Welcome back. It is week 5, DFS FanDuel Labs coming at you today, getting ready for the first of the bye weeks. Week 5, got some premium teams on bye. We're down to a 10-team main slate, which kind of condenses things, but it also, it brings us some very, very interesting decision points, leverage points, some game theory. It really, you start to see the chalk condense as we have smaller player pools. So it's really, this is kind of where you separate the men from the boys as far as decisions go, and having to kind of figure out how you're going to attack each week and account for all the little nuances that they present. So without further ado, I will bring my esteemed colleague on stage with me. Maximus, how are we doing today?
So far, so good. Good to be with you again this week.
Yes, as always, you're a couple weeks removed from the road now. Life is back to stable. We're all good there. How was week 4 for you? How did it treat you?
Well, my first name is Steven, and that's what it was, even Steven. In the 5-entry max that we usually cover every week, 2 of my 5 teams placed. My best team was 65th place, 151 points, I think was the total. I was in first place for a little while there into the beginning of the second half of the 4 o'clock games, and then Christian McCaffrey just took over, and I didn't have him on that team that I had been at that spot in. And so, yeah, all the CMAC people wound up running me down.
Yeah, it's always interesting with those like premium price players. It is hard to, when you're making a roster, sometimes pricing on these guys on FanDuel or DraftKings on any site, the high end guys, it feels a little uncomfortable just because, and you can get thinking like, well, I'll be fine as long as he doesn't get like X number, but also, those guys are priced there for a reason. So once in a while, they're going to get, they're going to, I mean, that was kind of a historic day for CMC, but, guys like him, Tyreek, Jefferson, they've got that in them where, once or twice a year, they're going to put a score up that is like, oh yeah, that way passes that number that I said, as long as they don't get tier, I'm fine. So, but it also goes to show, like you said, you didn't really have him, and you still broke even on the week. So even on those weeks where there's that one guy that really separates from everybody and kind of becomes, a must-have to win, you can still have success. You can find other guys who perform, and that just kind of lends credence to the idea of like playing for first and not being afraid to take risks or not feeling like you have to account for every player every week, because you might miss out on them, but you can still be all right with it. So just some interesting thoughts there, because I think that's a trap that we all, myself included, fall into sometimes, where it's like, oh man, I can't pass up on this guy. He could like ruin my week. But if you try to, it's like in life, if you're trying to do too many things, you're going to do them all like mediocre. It's the same way in DFS. Like if you're trying to play everybody, like essentially you're playing nobody.
There was one golden rule of tournaments that I forgot to adhere to this past week, though, and I had a little bit of them. But so you had 2 running backs on FanDuel that were in the same game, that were the same price, but one of them was about 25% owned, and the other one was like maybe 1% owned, and that was Javonte Williams and Khalil Herbert. On my 5 teams, I only had Khalil Herbert on one of them, and I had Javonte on like 2 or 3 of them. Now, obviously, he got injured, and we don't know what he ultimately would have done. But Khalil Herbert, I mean, when you have a price point where it's the same skill set of players, in this case, they happen to be in the same game, but one of them is so much owned than the other when it comes to tournaments. The golden rule would be maybe steer. It's a little bit of a risk, like you said, but you steer toward the player that's not owned. And at the same price point, if he does go off, or at least even goes even with, in this case, Javonte, that's going to help you out more than having the extremely owned player when you're doing tournaments. So.
Yeah, that's an interesting one too, because it's like, and I didn't play either of them, but it was kind of for the same reason, because to me, both of them were kind of timeshare backs. Like there was no real certainty or strong lean for either of them having like this like huge workload. Obviously, the matchup looked great on paper with both defenses looking bad. But yeah, to your point, like Herbert was essentially the same bet as Javonte. Like, he's a struggling offense facing a bad defense, kind of has a little over 50% of the backfield work so far coming into last week. So yeah, you're what everyone, what the field, what all the chalk was playing Javonte, what they were expecting and hoping for. You could make the same exact argument for Herbert. Like they could just, I think the scary part with him is that the guy behind him is Roschon Johnson, who's like a kind of a rookie who's kind of been hyped and in dynasty and best ball stuff. Like he got a lot of like, positive buzz around him. And he'd been playing a decent amount. So I think the fear on Herbert for most people was probably like it was going to go the other way, and he'd play like 20% of the snaps, but he just like dominated the work. I think he had like 23 opportunities or something. So yeah, but to your greater point, being able to zoom out and see that the situations, how similar they are, and the discrepancy in ownership, those are the types of spots where you can really kind of separate yourself.
Yeah, if you're going to go with risk, preferably low owned as opposed to chalk.
Right. All right, so we'll get into it here. I'm going to share my screen and pull up. So as always, we are building for one of your entries in the 30K Sunday NFL touchdown. It's a 5-entry max contest. It is 524 total people, $65 entry. And it is $4,000 to first. Again, there are 131 places paid out. That's 25% of the field, which is a large number relative. A lot of tournaments are like that 18 to 21% range. So really love the structure. We talk about that every week. If you're new, definitely want to check out this contest. The 5 max is kind of an equalizer, and it's a smaller field, so it's definitely more viable to take down a tournament like this. So with that said, I've got your team up that you shared with me before we went on here. If you want to kind of take me through it and give me your thoughts, and we'll go from there.
Sounds good. And yeah, just for reference, I knock on wood when I say this, I guess, but I've placed at least one team out of 5 every week in this tournament. One week I had 3 teams, one week 2, or last week 2 teams. So yeah, it's a very good setup, very viable tournament. So on this team, we start with Jalen Hurts. What I like about Jalen Hurts on FanDuel, because I do play on DraftKings as well. On DraftKings, he's only separated by $200 with Mahomes, but on FanDuel, it's a whole $600 separation. So a little more of a value on FanDuel here. So I have Jalen Hurts, and I have him paired with Skinny Batman, Devontae Smith. A.J. Brown's kind of been the crusher so far this year, but I always consider Devontae and A.J. Brown 1A and 1B receivers in that offense. Devontae is definitely capable of putting up a big game. And then I have a run back of Tyler Higbee on the Rams. We don't really know about the Cooper Kupp news yet. So I originally had a team with Atwell, but if Cooper Kupp's going to play, and obviously Puka is going to be Nakua is going to be a focal point of their offense still, it's kind of getting cheap exposure on the run back to the Hurts Devontae Smith stack. Then I have Jahmyr Gibbs and Breece Hall as your running backs. And then we have Tyreek Hill. We have Adam Thielen. And then the defense is the Tennessee Titans. Tennessee Titans are a pass funnel defense, but that's probably the weakest part of Anthony Richardson's game to this point. And they seem to be pretty opponent specific in the way they do their defense every week. Interesting about the Tyreek Hill, Jahmyr Gibbs. So I was playing around, and based on the prices, even though they're two different game environments, they're both game environments I want exposure to because Detroit has a 27-point individual team total. And obviously the Dolphins are like 30. A Kane or Mostert are very viable as far as Dolphins you can use. But this team will be Gibbs and Hill. But because I build 5 teams, you could actually swap Gibbs for David Montgomery and Tyreek Hill for Jalen Waddle, and it wouldn't change anything as far as your total team price. And I kind of just stumbled upon that. I wasn't expecting it, but that's kind of cool if you're doing 5 teams. You can kind of have exposure to multiple pieces of these offenses between the Dolphins and the Lions. It seems like Carolina's defense has kind of been inviting the run this year. And with Amon-Ra St. Brown injured, Josh Reynolds has popped up with an injury. And you can run on Carolina at home in Detroit. I would think that they'll utilize probably both backs potentially a little bit more this week. And then Breece Hall, I just think there's news that I just read a little while ago where he's not on a snap count anymore starting this week. And we all know the talent of Breece Hall, and he's playing the worst run defense in football. So not really worried about the Dalvin Cook split. I'm sure he'll get his carries, but at 6,500, I think that's a good price point for the talent and skill set that Breece Hall provides. And then Adam Thielen, not typically a player that I target in tournaments. However, oddly, I kind of looked at his statistics so far. He's in the top 20 in targets in the league. He already has 2 touchdowns this year, and he's averaging more than 2x his salary overall. And that's kind of the bring back to Gibbs or Montgomery. So you kind of have a skinny stack of correlation with that game. Mm-hmm. So that's a little bit of an explanation of this particular team.
Yeah, that's the Thielen, he's got 31 targets in the last 3 games, so averaging double digits. Since obviously, week 1 is always kind of weird for teams. So if you throw that out, he's averaging double digit targets. It's a game that you can reasonably expect them to be playing from behind with how good Detroit's look. Detroit's playing on, they've got 10 days rest coming off the Thursday night game. You bring up Jahmyr Gibbs. I think he's an interesting case study with, there's been so much about him because he got so much hype. He's the rookie. He's exciting. He's looked good. He's so flashy and so quick that, all summer when they're playing without pads, you see all these highlights and him making these crazy catches and flying around. But then David Montgomery's kind of stolen the show. And, there's so much to do about they're misusing him and this and that. But, when you zoom out and you look at the whole situation for the Lions, in week 3, David Montgomery missed the game against the Falcons. So Gibbs became the feature back. He had 17 carries for 80 yards, only had 2 targets, and it was 1 reception for 2 yards. Now, the Falcons' offense was terrible, couldn't move the ball. So the Lions were basically in control of that game, and Gibbs was being used as like the feature back, a lot of inside runs, taking more pounding than he's used to. So from a coaching perspective, you look at, they play 4 days later in Green Bay. Gibbs is probably, pretty banged up and he's taken a bit of a pounding from his biggest NFL workload. And then they have Montgomery back, who's fresh, who sat out week 3. So it makes sense that they would just ride Montgomery, especially when the game went how it did, where the Packers fell behind by so much so quick. So I think there's just, everybody, the NFL season moves so quick. There's only 17 regular season games for each team. We're about a quarter of the way through. But the reality is that makes each game so much easier to overreact to. And I think, those exercises, kind of thinking about things from a coach's perspective and zooming out, looking at the organization as a whole and what they're doing. And now you've got, like you said, you've got Gibbs, you've got off of a 10-day rest, you've got Gibbs fresh. He's had 10 days. He hasn't been used as much in a great matchup. And, interesting, I don't know if you saw it this week, but Austin Eckler, he actually has like a podcast or like a live stream show he does every week for fantasy. And he was talking about the running back position and these guys in particular. And he was just saying how there's a lot of like little nuance to the position with how Montgomery is setting up his holes and his patience and vision, and just some little things that kind of once Gibbs figures it out, he'll be able to do those same things and learn from Montgomery, but he'll explode through those holes quicker. And he just isn't quite there yet. So a lot of like coaching things where Montgomery's going to have more trust, and the way this game sets up, you would expect again, coaching perspective, you have to think about how they are, I guess, seeing this game, and they're 10-point favorites against the Panthers coming off rest. They're going to come in pretty confident. So like if there's some things that they think Gibbs needs to work on and figure out, like this is the game where you give him some chances. You're at home. You've got plenty of prep time. The rookie on the short week on the division rival, like your main competition to win the division, that's not the game where you lean on Gibbs. So it'll be interesting. And I do think at his depressed price point and with kind of the narrative around him, I think that's really interesting. I love your Gibbs, Tyreek equal to Waddle and Montgomery.
You switch it out.
Yeah, so like you could switch those guys out, and when you do that, so you could basically just build the same exact roster. And with regards to this week and this roster, you look at the rest of your roster, and other than your defense and Thielen, everybody else is late games. So, you could, and Thielen is correlated with a Detroit running back one way or the other. So, in theory, you could just run the same exact roster twice, with the different iterations of it. And then, you could see how it goes, and it depending on which one hits and what the ownership percentages are, of Montgomery, Waddle, or Tyreek, Gibbs, whichever one. If one of those really takes off, based on whatever that ownership is, you can look at the rest of the roster and say, do I want to stick with these guys? Do I want to adjust somewhere? Do I need to find, a less chalky piece? So it just gives you a lot of options. And when you're playing multiple lineups, you have this like kind of roster block. You can kind of ham and egg it, and have if you have high confidence in various situations, you can have different combinations of how they play out, how you're seeing it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
So I think that's really good. I like your Devontae Smith call, just kind of going away from when you have these 1A, 1B type situations. It's like, for years, like I literally placed high in tournaments and won tournaments for like a couple straight years just by like playing whoever was lower owned between Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. I remember like when the year Jameis was there, it was just like, all right, whichever one the field's not on, I'll just play that guy. And it worked out several times. But yeah, I think, Devontae, lower priced, likely lower owned, interesting. And you brought up Tyler Higbee. I wanted to talk about this because we were talking before we went on air about the tight end position. And it really is. And the thing with FanDuel and the tight end position is like when all else fails, you can just stack it. You can just stack it and just play the tight end from your game, whether it's associated with your quarterback or going the other way. Like in this, Higbee fits perfectly with the rest of this roster. And, defensively, I like your thoughts on the Titans play. It gets a little thin going below that. So I think that they're like the lowest, like in play, like you're not just banking on a fluky defensive touchdown. Like they could actually like control this game. I think they'll be somewhat chalky, but you've done enough like kind of unique things elsewhere in your lineup that I don't think that necessarily matters in your size contest. Because it makes it work, right? But the other, if you did have a couple $100, it would be, you've also got Goddard is priced only at 5,500, so you could fit him in there. If you'd have to move off something somewhere else. But to my greater point, like Higbee, even if Kupp comes back, whether Kupp comes back or not, if you can make the argument if Kupp comes back, their offense is just probably more likely to succeed against a tough Philly defense. And really, you just need Higbee to fall in the end zone. Like you're just hoping if he falls in the end zone and gets 10 points, like you're golden. Like you really are. Like salary multipliers be damned. The tight end position, if you get some production, if you just don't get like a 4-point game, you're ahead of like 3/4 of the field. So, and there haven't really been, when we look at the tight end position, there haven't been those like huge, like run away from the field games. And with the way pricing is, like Travis Kelce will $8,789. He's on sale. He's on sale this week. But like at that price, like if he scores 22 and Higbee scores 10, it's not that big of a, so yeah, just playing that correlation, like when all else fails, like you don't have to overthink and get in the weeds. It's also interesting to me. I wanted to bring this up because, in Discord and on Twitter, I see all these people talking about like D versus P, like defense versus position. Like, oh, this team's bad against tight ends. This team's good against receivers, bad against receivers. But like NFL teams, they don't operate the same way our fantasy teams do. So like what I mean by that is I'm like, yes, Travis Kelce is a tight end and Jonnu Smith is a tight end or Dalton Schultz, but they don't play the same position. You know what I mean? Like they're not doing the same things. They're not being asked to do the same things. Same with like wide receivers. Like there's different wide receivers who technically they're a wide receiver, but where they're lined up, where they're used, how often they're used, like they're not, it's not the same position. So like sometimes those stats can be really skewed because, like the Vikings defense, for instance, they played the Chiefs this week. I just did the NFL Edge right up on it last night. And so like, if you look at the Vikings defense, I'll find a Chiefs receiver here. I'm going to have to scroll a while. So you got Sky Moore, right? Playing the Vikings defense. They're ranked 32nd opponent rank. You see here, 32nd in against receivers, right? But okay, now when you look at the Vikings, okay, who have they played? Week 1, Tampa Bay, Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, clearly the two best offensive players on their team. Week 2, Philadelphia, AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, maybe the best wide receiver duo, for sure top 3 in the league. Week 3, Chargers. You have Mike Williams before he got hurt and Keenan Allen. Again, one of the top duos in the league. So it's like, yeah, the Vikings have been bad against wide receivers, but they've played some damn good ones. They've played teams who like are featuring and built around those wide receivers. Now you've got the Chiefs who they have, like last week, they had 5 receivers play at least 24% of their snaps, and they had no receivers play over 61% of their snaps. And, I dove into this as well. The running backs combined for half of the team's like opportunities, targets and carries, 50% of those opportunities. So the usage for the team was to the running backs, and 40% of the targets went to tight ends. So you've got like you've got this Kansas City team that's not built at all. Like the wide receiver is like their least favorite part of their offense. It's the least trusted part. So it's just an interesting spot where, like, yeah, maybe the Vikings aren't great against wide receivers and maybe they've given up a lot of production. But I think that it's just you got to pull back the layers there, to kind of see it, because it doesn't necessarily mean that a team, a player that has that great matchup is for sure gonna excel in that matchup on paper, because you got to account for what the other team's previous competition was and how that works together.
And I'm glad you went to that game. It's a good roll-in, because the only spot I didn't cover was my flex spot, which is Isiah Pacheco. The thinking there is a couple different things. Levers. If you want Hurts to do well, you don't want Mahomes to do as well. So Pacheco kind of is that lever that you hope the touchdowns come through the run. Pacheco is also number 8 in the league in red zone rushing attempts to this point. He has 13. He has cashed in, I think, 1 touchdown off that. So, he's due. And that's a good way to get exposure to that game, which obviously has a high overall game total. And obviously the Chiefs have the individual team total. So that's a lever thing that I did with that. Alexander Madison's also very viable. You could even do a skinny between him and Madison, maybe on another team. And then 2 more quick points. The Higbee, Eagles are 31st in the league against the tight end spot. So that's a bonus on that stack. And then, I was just thinking about this. I
just told you that doesn't matter, Maximus.
That's true.
I'm just kidding. See, no.
Don't be blinded by the green color.
No, sorry I cut you off there, but I do think it's relevant because, again, it's the same exercise I just talked about. So you look back at Philly's schedule. Well, they played Washington, Cole Turner and Logan Thomas, Tampa Bay, Cade Otton. Obviously, Hawkinson had a very good game against Minnesota. He's obviously a premium player. And then you have Hunter Henry and Mike Gesicki, I guess, for the Patriots, who are, they're not standout. They're nothing like special, like jump off the page type guys. So that is one where it's like, wow, they're 31st in the league against tight ends. They've only played 1 like high end tight end. And this is a game where, yeah, like if the story plays out, like what was the game situation where they gave up that big game to Hawkinson? Well, it was like they scored a bunch of points. Well, I'm betting on them scoring a bunch of points here by playing Hurts and Smith. So yeah, it sets up to where they probably are going to be set up to give up a bunch of points to the tight end position. So yeah, like, sorry to jump in there on you, but it's just a perfect example of just doing that digging. Like, is this number for real? And does it actually help me this week? And in this case, I think it does.
And also to your point, certain tight ends are used different ways, just like wide receivers. Some tight ends are used more for blocking. Some tight ends are used more for, established passing routes. It'll be interesting if Kupp plays or not. That may affect a little bit how Higbee is used based on if Kupp's going to be back or not. One other avenue you can explore here, we were doing the switch up with Montgomery, Waddle, and Gibbs and Hill. Another thing you could do, if you think you're a little thin, is you could actually do Gibbs and Waddle, and then that frees up a lot of money. So maybe instead of Thielen, you could probably run back Hurts and Devontae with Puka Nacua or somebody like that. And you can kind of beef up, instead of Higbee, maybe you add Goddard with Hurts, like you were saying, and Devontae, and then maybe you do a bring back of Puka. That may work out. I'm not sure because I didn't explore it, but I'm sure you're probably right in the realm.
Yeah, and you'd actually have 1,100 left then. So, at that point you could
better defense. Yeah.
Yeah, you could go up at your defense, and that's where you could play KC, correlate that. You could play the Patriots at home against, kind of struggling Saints offense.
Dolphins defense.
Broncos are really bad, but they're playing Zach Wilson.
That's true.
He looked good on Sunday night, or better than he has, but he's still Zach Wilson. And then you got
Also, the Dolphins defense could be a good kind of switch out. You just play the defense instead of the offensive players, maybe, and you go to another good game environment, maybe. So, yeah, the main thing I've noticed on FanDuel this year, and maybe it's just random or just happens to be that way, is the game environments that I've wanted exposure to and the players within those game environments, based on the price points, have seemingly been interchangeable, which is great for a 5-entry max setup. And I don't know if that's going to continue, but it just so happens the last few weeks that it's played out that way.
Yeah. So I want to talk real quick about the Chiefs defense, because like I said, I did that NFL Edge write-up this week. And so I think they're really interesting because I see this game as the Chiefs are going to score points. They're going to score some points. Like, they're not going to score less than 20 points. And I think they could score 40 points if they had to. It could go that way. The interesting thing with the Vikings defense is they lead the league in blitz rate at 60%. It's over 20% higher than the next highest team. They're just sending guys every play. And Mahomes is really, really good against the blitz. But that's extra true in this instance because the Vikings are 29th in pressure percent. So they're blitzing a ton, but they're not getting home. And Mahomes is the best quarterback in the league at avoiding sacks. So the Chiefs are going to score. The Vikings are the interesting one because when you look at the Kirk Cousins, the dud games where he turns into a pumpkin and it's really bad, this is where the primetime Kirk, that whole narrative comes in. And I think it's true and it's false, but I don't think it gets enough play on what the real issue is. What the issue is that when the Vikings fall behind quickly and they become predictable. Now, they're a pass-heavy team, but there's a difference between passing a lot and the defense knowing you have to pass. So what happens is he's not one of these mobile quarterbacks that can extend plays. So he's another quarterback. He's actually very good against the blitz. So when they fall behind, the defense doesn't feel the need to blitz, and they can just rush 4 or 5 guys and drop 6 or 7 in coverage. Well, now no one opens up. And if the opposing team's front 4 is able to get pressure without blitzing, now he's being pressured and there's a bunch of defenders back there just waiting to cherry pick his passes. So you look at last year, this happened twice to him that I remember in big spots, game of the week spots. The Packers and the Cowboys both were late afternoon games. And I remember that Cowboys game because I built heavily around it. And the Cowboys won 40-3, but it was just they got out to a 17-3 lead. And then Cousins was just a sitting duck back there, and the Cowboys didn't have to blitz. They had 7 dudes sitting in coverage, and Parsons was getting there like that. So I see this as a potential Chris Jones, just collapsing the pocket from the interior and Cousins being pushed off his spot. It could get really ugly really quick if they fall behind. And I think that's the most likely way this game gets short circuited. And that's why I think the Vikings are the X factor in this game. It's got the highest total on the week. But it's going to come down to if the Vikings are able to score early and stay in control of that, they're not completely predictable, then it can turn into a high scoring game. But if the Chiefs get out to an early lead, the boat race could be on here.
And Kirk Cousins, no threat to run. So you get Chris Jones and company, you get the front 4 pressure. He's a sitting duck with the coverage.
Right. So that's why sometimes you'll get these games like the Colts game last year where they fell way behind, but then they made this huge comeback and had it scored all these points. Well, the issue there was the Colts did the same exact thing, but they weren't able to get any pressure. You know what I mean? So they weren't able to even he was able to stand back there all day, even when he was predictable. And I don't think that's going to be the case with the Chiefs. And to your point, the concern with, if he if we don't blitz and we don't get home and he stands back there all day, is like eventually like some of these other quarterbacks, they'll just take off and run for 8 yards. And, they'll just pick you apart that way, like Mahomes will do. But yeah, Cousins isn't really a threat there. So it's all about the game script and the game flow there. And it's really an interesting spot where I think that Chiefs defense is just such a clear, on all sites, really, it's such a clear, like, high upside play, I think. And it's probably not going to be high owned because that's not fun. And
from the roster construction point of view, I like how you put the Chiefs in there because there is correlation with Pacheco and the Chiefs. It's not necessarily adverse to have them paired together. So I like it from a roster construction point of view as well on one of the teams, maybe, or a couple.
Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah,
good stuff. All right. Well, I went off on a couple of my monologues today. Sorry about that. You've had to listen to me talk a bunch. Hopefully people learned some stuff and didn't turn me off. But any more parting shots, anything you want to talk about for week 5 before we head out?
Now, we all love listening to Coach Mike.
Yeah.
Coaching perspective is important. It's just as important as the roster construction angles. And so, yeah, I always appreciate the thoughts. And on the face of it, I wasn't even thinking about the Chiefs. Well, I kind of was, but I didn't have them necessarily as placement on a team yet, because obviously we still, these are just practice builds. But that's a lot of good points with the KC defense there. And that game last year, I know it all too well. That was my best finish last year. I made 3rd place with Pollard. Don't think I had the Cowboys defense on that team, but I definitely had Pollard, and he exploded in that one. Not so much so far.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and the coaching, the NFL is just such a unique – football is such a unique sport in that the coaches have such control over what happens on each play. They're literally calling the plays. Like even in basketball, like, yeah, you call plays, but there's so much that happens. The ball can end up so many different places to like literally everybody on the floor. But with coaching, like there's so many more tendencies and they have so much more direct impact based on how they think about that specific game. That's pretty clearly the biggest edge I think that you can find in NFL is being able to kind of get inside their heads and anticipate, how they'll react to some things. So, we'll keep trying to, be psychics for these unpredictable NFL coaches and see how that works out for us. But yeah, should be an interesting week. Like I said, only 10 teams on the slate or 10 games on the slate. So it condenses the player pool. I would think you'll have by the end of the week, when you have these smaller slates, you get the chalk condenses a little bit more because there's not as many like viable plays or good plays on paper and projection wise. So it opens up a lot more opportunity to make strong stands, I guess. So will be interesting to see how that plays out. This has always been my best string of DFS is during the bye weeks. So hopefully that holds true so that, go get some groceries on Monday.
Sounds good.
All right. We will see you next week. Thank you again, Maximus. And best of luck to the OWS fam. See you on Twitter and Discord. Check us out. Good luck. We'll see you in week 6.
1 week season.